Well, hello, my name is Mike McDonald. I'm your host for this presentation. Welcome to Crosspoint Coaching. I'm a marketplace minister, a former congregational care pastor. I've also taught Bowen systems theory at the university level for leadership and organizational behavior for managers and marketing. And I'm also currently a leader in a major Fortune 500 company. So I've had the privilege of utilizing Bowen's systems theory in multiple facets of life, including my home life as well. And so I'm excited that you're here today to watch this video. So this video is a review of Murray Bowen's 8 concepts from his theory, and it is taken from a book by Dr. Roberta Gilbert, who's done an absolute fascinating and wonderful job of putting together and helping us to understand what his theory is. And so if you're interested and you really want to learn more about this, I highly encourage you to go to her book called The 8 Concepts. A little bit about Dr. Gilbert. She is a trained psychiatrist, and her primary interest, which is why we are here today, is in Bowen family systems theory. And she's written many, many great books. I've read all of them. I recommend all of them about how to apply this theory not just to individuals, but to families, but also to organizational leaders and to therapists. And so, whether you are a therapist, a parent, a leader in a business, a leader in ministry, or you're just trying to work on growing as an individual, I highly recommend her works. She's very classically trained in Bowen systems theory. As you can see, her background is at the Menninger Clinic. She's done the postgraduate program at the Georgetown University Family Center. She was a member of the faculty at the Bowen Center and has served as a presenter and a supervisor, and was also an editorial consultant for what they call Family Systems, which was published by the Bowen Center. So she's highly credentialed and definitely knows what she is talking about. And so we're going to go through these 8 facets of Bowen systems theory one by one. The first one is what they call the nuclear family emotional system. And so Murray Bowen himself says that the nuclear family emotional system basically describes the 4 basic relationship patterns that govern when problems begin to develop in a family. And so, because we're human beings, we all have these really predictable and observable patterns of functioning, especially when there are periods of stress or anxiety. Keep in mind, anxiety can be really any type of feeling, any type of change that's happening in a family. Bowen uses the term anxiety as a broad term to categorize all those feelings. And so, the 4 patterns that emerge when we are under tension, especially chronic tension, can be 1, conflict; 2, what he calls the over-under functioning reciprocity; 3, triangling; and 4, distancing. And of course, the cousin of distancing, which is an extreme version of distancing, is what we call cutoff. And so these patterns, they're just automatic. We're people. They're things that we do. It's the way that we respond to anxiety when we're not our best. They're not necessarily moral failings. And the intensity of the symptoms that people display when under anxiety is really dependent upon the system's level of differentiation and the person's individual level of differentiation. And this usually comes from their family of origin. We'll talk a little bit more about what this means in a minute. But it's important to know that whether you are in a workplace or in a marriage, each partner brings with them from their own family of origin some emotional process or baggage into the marriage that will inform the way that they show up in that relationship. And of course, symptoms of anxiety in the system, in the marriage, in the family, in the workplace, they will arise once people begin adapting to the immaturity of those around them, as opposed to self-defining. And self-definition is something that a differentiated person does. And so let's talk about the functioning and kind of the way anxiety flows and the implication for leaders. Anxiety flows around the family system, or again, this could be a workplace system based off of the sensitivity, reactivity, and over-functioning and under-functioning capabilities or inclinations of the individuals. When this happens, partners will then begin to polarize into complementary roles. This is because the system always wants to have homeostasis. And so anytime you have a pursuer in a relationship, you'll always have a distancer. Anytime you have an overfunctioner, you'll always have an underfunctioner, because systems theory shows that there's homeostasis continually being sought by the system. Now, when parents in a family are trying to stabilize their marriage and they're dealing with these postures of anxiety, often we'll see one or more of the children absorb that anxiety. And we'll kind of unpack that in a little bit here moving forward. Emotional distance, which is another pattern that can actually reduce conflict, and people actually seek emotional distance when they get tired of conflict. And people falsely assume that they've made things better, but really, emotional distance just makes it worse because it lowers intimacy and it lowers connection with those around them. Higher differentiated people in the relationship, they're okay. They can stay connected and not distance without absorbing anxiety. And that's the trick. The trick as a high differentiated individual is to stay calm and connected, but also non anxious at the same time. And it's very hard to do both. As I mentioned earlier, while this concept was additionally made for families and for counseling, these concepts are very true for organizations as well, as teams in the workplace can definitely mirror nuclear family patterns. In fact, it's unfortunate, but sometimes we spend more time with our work family than we do with our families at home. And so this concept definitely carries over as well. But the key point in this section is that as leaders, we must monitor our own inclination to be reactive and not focus or worry on the symptoms or behaviors of others, because really their behavior is just a symptom of something that is wrong with the system. And quite often, their behavior is a symptom of maybe something that is wrong with us. And so change really begins, and a person can begin to function more maturely when they focus on themselves and not worrying about fixing those around them. Or as the stewardess says on the airplane, first put on your own oxygen mask before deciding to put on the oxygen mask of your neighbor. So if you're reviewing this with a team, or maybe you're looking to develop yourself, this would be a great time to pause. These are some great questions where you can discover your own emotional patterns in your own family of origin, or perhaps your nuclear family, or perhaps your workplace where you can grow in your differentiation. All certified and trained Bowen coaches have to go through a process like this. And so this is part of the way that you grow in your differentiation, is by answering these questions. The second concept is called the differentiation of self scale. Murray Bowen says that the scale is really simply an effort to classify all the different levels of human functioning, from the lowest possible levels, as you can see down on the bottom, and also in the symbols on the left, all the way to the highest potential level on one single dimension. And so you can see that the person on the top right, there's less overlap, meaning there's less give and take. They have more boundaries, and so they're less anxious. There's less fusion, and they have healthier relationships, where the two symbols in the bottom left are more fused. And so that means there's fewer boundaries, there's more fusion, there's less differentiation, and thus more problems in the relationship and in life. So a scale, as you can see from that image, goes from 0 to 100. The average person's probably somewhere between 35 to 55. According to Murray, you might see a person as high as 75 once in a lifetime. And over the course of all of history, you may see one person as being 100, such as Jesus. And so differentiation describes how well a person can balance both thinking and feeling systems, but also how well they can balance togetherness and individuality. We are all called to be around others, but we still need to be who we were designed to be. At the same time, we can't be so individualistic that we neglect the communities that we are a part of. And so we know that we are experiencing higher differentiation when we can have clear thinking under pressure, we can have lower reactivity, and we can have stable functioning across all aspects of life. And we know that we are experiencing lower differentiation when we become fused or enmeshed with others. We become more emotionally reactive. We are more impulsive in our decision making, and our anxiety is more chronic across all aspects of our lives. Now, depending on who you are and your own family of origin story, we as people operate at different levels and show different predictable functioning patterns depending on the relationship at hand. So you can have someone that does a really great job at work, but maybe they do too good of a job and they overfunction at work. That same person could underfunction at home with their family. And so these predictable patterns can show up differently depending on the system that the person is operating in. Now, Gilbert does a great job of emphasizing what Bowen would say, which is the scale is descriptive. This is not judgmental. It is simply a map of emotional maturity. And I will say that differentiation is not a destination. It is simply a direction. It is a place that we're aiming towards. And if all of us can only grow by a few points over the entirety of our lives, then it is a journey that has been well worth it. Now, we'll talk about this more later, but differentiation, it's important to know, is shaped not only by our family of origin and our experience with our parents, but by their parents and by their parents' parents. And this is what we call the multi-generational transmission process. And so differentiation is not about willpower, it's not about personality, it's just about understanding how we were formed by the people in our families who came before us. And I would say this last point is the most important. If we seek to move or to grow on the scale, it comes from having an attitude of working on oneself. If we come into this with an attitude of how can we change or fix others or make them do things differently, we will not grow in our differentiation, and I would argue that a case could be made that you would actually decline in your differentiation. And so how does this scale operate for leaders and individuals in real life? Well, we talked about this earlier, but higher differentiation as the goal, right, can reduce the impact of other concepts, which we're going to get into, such as sibling position. If you have higher differentiation, you're less likely to be impacted by the position of your birth in your family. You're less likely to be negatively impacted by projection. You're less likely to be impacted by the triangles that form around you and by over and under functioning reciprocity. Whereas lower differentiation can actually amplify and make worse those patterns that we just discussed from the family's nuclear emotional system. So if you have lower differentiation, you may really live into and follow the assumed sibling position assumptions that we'll discuss in the future. You might easily take on the projection of others. You might easily be more vulnerable to triangling from others. If there is an overfunctioning in your life, overfunctioner in your life, and you have low differentiation, you are more likely to reciprocate by underfunctioning. And so under stress, all of us as people, we slide towards these patterns of conflict, distance, over underfunctioning, and triangling. But when we decide to, or we grow as a leader with higher differentiation, we can then become calm. We can stay connected at the same time, and we become self-defined even though we are in an anxious system. And so this scale is just a great resource for us to get a good understanding of how we might handle pressure, thinking, overreacting, about how we handle closeness, seeing the importance of being connected but not being fused, not losing boundaries, and how we can see the importance of autonomy. That is, defining ourselves as opposed to completely removing ourselves from others. And the key point of this concept, I would say, is that even having a tiny, tiny increase in your differentiation can have an incredible impact on the system of which you are a part. It doesn't take, and that's what's great about this, when we're coaching clients, we don't need the whole family there or the whole team there. But if we focus on the person most willing to grow in their differentiation, the rest of the people around them will change as well. And that's what's so fascinating about this concept. However, it does take sustained work and commitment, and it really requires an authentic willingness to focus on your own functioning and be less concerned about the functioning of others. And so these are the two questions where you can pause and stop and sincerely sit down and think about, what does this look like in your own life, and what are some of your patterns that maybe are opportunities to grow. So the third concept is that of triangles. Murray Bowen says the triangle is the smallest, most stable part of the relationship system. When anxiety increases, two people immediately involve the most vulnerable third person to become part of the triangle. And I will say we can also actually triangle non-personal objects like work or television or policy or government or something like that. Triangling can happen outside of people as well. And so these are the basic concepts from Bowen and Gilbert. We talked about how the triangle is the most basic unit. They form automatically and predictably when dyads or twosomes become uncomfortable. The third person or object ends up absorbing the anxiety, and because they are absorbing the anxiety, this reduces the tension of the initial dyad. It makes everyone feel better, but it doesn't necessarily resolve the issue, although they may sometimes falsely believe that they have. And so you'll see this in families or the workplace through gossiping or rumors or insinuation. That is triangling in action. Triangles can be stable, or they can shift depending on circumstances that change in the environment. It just really depends on the anxiety levels and the relation sensitivities of the people involved. We can also have different positions in the triangle. If you're the inside position, you are part of that conflict. You're closer, there's more tension. If you're the outside position, that means they're attempting to pull you in. The two who are in conflict, one of them is attempting to pull you in. I will say the good thing about being in the outside position is if you can stay differentiated, you can really leverage that outside position to produce positive change within the organization. Triangles are universal. They're like gravity. They just are. They're a part of life. We see them in families and marriages and churches and teams. All of us organize and manage our own anxiety through triangles. And I will say that triangles can be productive and unproductive. And so you'll hear people talk about de-triangling. I would never necessarily say that de-triangling is possible or a goal, but I can say that we could definitely lead through a triangle and try to make them more productive by being neutral, by being calm, and by putting the work on the two people with whom the original conflict originated. And so it is our own level of differentiation at the time that really determines how much you will or will not get pulled into or can step out of or lead your way through a triangle. And so, how do they operate under anxiety and in leadership? Well, under stress, which we all experience, triangles will intensify. We'll begin to see alliances form. We can see people who begin getting blamed, and we can see an increase in emotional distance. Under extreme intensity, you'll actually begin to see cutoff happening as well. But really, triangles are just masking deeper issues such as marital tension, rivalry among siblings, or workplace conflict. And so, if you're in the outside of that triangle, yes, you may feel some relief, but you're still going to become vulnerable at some point in time, being pulled into that triangle, especially during spikes of anxiety. And so when you are getting triangled, sometimes it's because they want you to try and solve the problem for them as opposed to them solving the problem themselves. They're giving you anxiety that is theirs and not yours. And so you should let them keep that and hang on to it and be a calm, non anxious presence. So the great news is if you are highly differentiated in a situation, you can stay connected to that triangle without taking sides. You can become neutral. You can avoid becoming part of the conflict, and you can still maintain clear thinking and make good decisions for your family or your workplace while others are being reactive. And of course, emotions are a contagion. like a virus. And so if you maintain that clear thinking long enough over time, they will eventually follow you because calm is contagious. So the key point here is while we can't stop triangles from forming, we can definitely change how we show up and how we participate in them as people. And so here are our two questions for consideration and for developing differentiation. And now we have our fourth concept, which is cutoff. Murray Bowen tells us that in average family situation in our society today, people unfortunately maintain a distant and formal relationship, a necessary formal relationship, I would say, with their families, returning home out of a sense of duty at very infrequent intervals. In fact, America, you could say, is known as a nation of cutoffs, unfortunately. And so, as we discussed earlier, cutoff is an extreme form of distancing and is something that we use to manage unresolved anxiety or conflict in relationships. It happens when people reduce or sever contact in an attempt to escape fusion, conflict, or emotional intensity. I will say, while it is not discussed in Bowen systems theory, any therapist or coach worth their weight will definitely tell you if there's one situation where this does not apply, and that is if you're experiencing severe emotional or psychological abuse, if you're experiencing physical abuse, then definitely cut off is warranted and necessary. And so never feel compelled to go back to a person who is causing you extreme mental or physical grief. That being said, getting back to theory, Bowen does emphasize that cutoff is not resolving really anything. It's not helping with any underlying immaturity. It simply relocates it, and I would say even exacerbates it. And so, three of the symptoms of cutoff include very rigid emotional distance, the complete avoidance of contact or conversation. You'll see people continually looking for reasons to get away, and you can see that spills over into other relationships. Those other relationships become more intense because they are subconsciously continually thinking about the person from the relationship in which they have been cut off. We see this very commonly, unfortunately, in coaching between parents and adult children. It's probably one of the most common forms of coaching that I work with. And we also see it amongst siblings and former parents, people who are, or former partners, people who are divorced but still very emotionally fused to one another, and that's caused by cutoff. And so cutoff gives this just illusion that things are calm, that things are okay, but really that anxiety and tension just spills over into other relationships. And so, how does cutoff function in families and in leadership? It increases the vulnerability to fusion in new relationships, as we discussed, because that anxiety remains unresolved. So, you start becoming more undifferentiated in other relationships. People who are experiencing cutoff or using cutoff become overly intense in substitute relationships. I've seen this as a pastor in the church. I've seen people who are cut off from their children, from their family of origin, and so they have no influence with them. The child became very tired of the parent over functioning. So, as the pastor, you'll see, especially a senior congregational member, they'll start trying to overfunction on one of the pastors or someone on their staff. This is a good example of how cutoff really doesn't become resolved. And so, cutoff, and we'll talk about this a little bit more, but it disrupts the flow of multi generational information. It makes people more reactive. In almost every single family in America today, there's at least one family member who is cut off from a portion of the family. And that's really unfortunate because you don't get to know or learn things about your family because maybe a parent or an aunt or an uncle is completely cut off from that side of the family. And so the result in families is that cutoff can lead to very polarizing sibling roles. We can see a heightened projection by a mother and father onto a child, and we can see very chronic tension happen between those parents, and maybe it can spill over into workplace or church or into volunteer organizations. In leadership roles, we see cutoff showing up as people in the workplace just avoiding difficult conversations, or maybe changing teams or changing roles in order to escape that tension. Nowadays, we actually see people quiet quitting, or we'll see people really over investing in another relationship. Maybe you have a mother who's experiencing the children move out of the house, they're experiencing tension with their husband, and it's not being addressed. And so you might see that mother really over volunteer in the church or the PTA to a really unhealthy level. They became a chronic over functioner. And so these are our questions for consideration in developing our differentiation here in this section. We're halfway there. Next is what they call the family projection process. And so you can see here in this graphic, there's tension between the mother and the father, and they become like helicopter parents, overly focused on the child. So Murray Bowen tells us this is the process through which undifferentiation by the parental units actually impairs one or more children. And this process is so universal that it's present to some degree in every family. Your first triangle that you've had in your entire life is from your parents or whomever you lived with in your family of origin. So if you lived with your grandparents, that would be your first triangle. And so in this process, parents transmit their own unresolved anxiety with each other onto their child by chronically over focusing on them. This is a process that unfortunately can be automatic, it's very unconscious, and the intensity can vary by the family, by the time, or by the child. So maybe it was during a time where a father lost his business that the child was born. That person could become overly focused. Maybe it was during a time where a mother lost a parent who their child was named after. That child could become focused during that time. There's different circumstances and events that can happen in a family's life, and during that significant, what they call a nodal event, that can result on a child becoming overly focused on. You can be the oldest child of your family and have 3 daughters, and as a mother who is the oldest child who went through lots of challenges, you could focus on the oldest daughter. These are the ways that children become projected onto by parents. And so the parent becomes anxiously focused on a child. The parent interprets then that child's response to that focus through their own anxious lens, and paradoxically, the child starts misbehaving. And so then the parent justifies that overfocus, and they begin to think that their perceived problem is real, which only goes into a downward spiral, and it's repeated over and over again, and we see bad behavior being reinforced. So over time, when this becomes chronic, the child begins to absorb the parent's fear and anxiety. It becomes their own. It can negatively impact and shape their identity and their functioning, so that when they leave their family of origin and go out into the world, they can become a very low functioning individual, which is why we have family system coaches today. We help people go back into their family of origin and resolve some of this dysfunction so that they can grow into higher levels of differentiation. We'll talk about this more too, but this process is also multi-generational. It doesn't just happen between children and their parents, but their parents learn it from their parents, and those parents learn it from their parents. So this is something that gets passed down from generation to generation, which is also, by the way, a title of a great book on family systems theory by Edwin Friedman. And so what are the implications for leaders in regards to this projection and how it shapes functioning? In the transmission, things that get transmitted are relationship sensitivities, or these postures that I talked about earlier, the ability, the habit of triangling. If it happens in one family member, that unhealthy habit can get passed down to a next person. And this can also come through in behaviors like needing approval or self-blame or being over-responsible or being a very emotionally reactive person. The person who is representing and carrying the most anxiety of that family is what they call the symptom bearer or the identified patient. So sometimes you'll have a kiddo that's acting out, maybe like a teenager, and they're not attending school and they're making bad decisions, and you'll have parents bring them in and they think that the child is really the problem in the family, but the child is actually really just representing the anxiety that's happening in the family. And sometimes in coaching these situations, you'll find out maybe a parent is having an affair, or a parent is dealing with drugs, or the parents are thinking about going through divorce and they haven't been talking about it out loud. These are all ways that the anxiety actually shows up through the symptom bearer of the family or through one of the children. And so we talked about things that can influence which child is selected as the focus. That can be birth order, parental stress, or maybe a child who's born with a health condition. And so they get some type of status that results in them being focused in. And so a history of family projection from your family of origin will always carry on to you in other roles, both positively and negatively. You could have a sibling who is highly focused on in your family of origin, and they left the family of origin, unfortunately, being less differentiated, and you can actually walk out of that situation being and having a higher level of differentiation because you are not the focused on individual. And so projection mirrors organizational dynamics. And so we take from our family of origin into our place of work or place that we serve and volunteer. If we overfunction in our family of origin, we will overfunction in our workplace. If we had a younger sibling that was the problem person and the symptom bearer, and we as a sibling was encouraged to overfunction and take over for them, we will do the same thing in the workplace or in the church or where we volunteer. And so our anxiety is what drives this overhelping, this rescuing, this micromanaging. In ministry, we see it with pastors or staff members taking on a martyr complex. And so the way that we correct this behavior is by raising our own level of differentiation and not fixing those around us. Because as differentiated leaders, we reduce our overfocus and we give people permission to fail, to learn, and to then function for themselves. The greatest gift you can give people is to let them go in the direction that you are afraid they are headed. And so these are your questions for consideration in developing your own differentiation. So this family projection process can be multi-generational. Bowen says, and I can confirm this, if we follow the most impaired child through successive generations, we will see one line of descent producing lower and lower levels of differentiation. As coaches, we actually map this out into what is called a genogram. If you are seeing a Bowen therapist or Bowen coach, I encourage you to map out a genogram of your family. It's a requirement of all Bowen coaches. I did it myself. It's an incredible process where you can begin to see patterns, both positive and negative, for both yourself and those that you're with. And really, it just empowers you to respond to others with grace and to know that sometimes we can't control the cards we are dealt, but we can only control the way that we play those cards, so to speak. And so in this multi-generational transmission process, the theory tells us that families transmit levels of differentiation, both good and bad. They transmit relationship sensitivities, postures, and anxiety patterns across multiple generations. Children don't necessarily inherit traits, but they inherit habits or ways of functioning in relationship. And as they go out into the world or the workplace, they bring those habits and ways of functioning with them, for better and for worse. And so this process unfolds through very small shifts in functioning from one generation to the next. So it may take 5, 6, 7, 8 generations before these habits and ways of functioning become exacerbated. We actually see this in Murray Bowen's research and study of schizophrenia, that schizophrenia really is a buildup of multiple generations of dysfunction. We see that lower levels of differentiation in two parents can tend to produce greater vulnerability and a greater propensity for low-level differentiation in one of the children. It's usually the, quote, most sensitive child. Unfortunately, that becomes the focus of projection, and this can unfortunately then shape their future functioning as they leave the family and go out into the real world. And then we can see each generation recreating familiar patterns. And so, as those people go out into the real world, they'll usually marry someone of a similar functioning. And again, we will see those familiar family patterns of conflict, distance, over under functioning, and triangling getting passed on to the next generation. This transmission is subtle, but fortunately, it is predictable, it is continuous, and it's something that as coaches we can help people learn to identify and over time slowly correct. And so, this family emotional process is always going to be carried forward unless someone in the system raises their own level of differentiation. And that's why I'm doing this video, because it's a great way for us to learn how we can change. And so, how does this shape families and leadership, and what are its symptoms? We talked about this a little bit, but symptoms in one generation often mirror unresolved issues in previous generations. It is indeed ironic that cutoff will only intensify transmission, because when you break contact with the very people who hold the key to information that you need to learn in order to become differentiated, you can't do that if you have broken contact. And so we see that how we learn to show up in marriage, how we learn to show up as siblings, how we project onto others or allow others to project onto us, these all flow through multiple generations over time. And then we see that people with lower levels of differentiation, they will always repeat these relationship postures and habits in their own marriage, in the ways that they parent, and in the ways that they lead and show up at work. While those who grow and develop into higher levels of differentiation will disrupt and break these unhealthy patterns, they'll break this unhealthy transmission because they've learned clear thinking under pressure. They've learned to pause and become less reactive, and they've learned to act more out of principles and value systems in their functioning as opposed to simply being emotionally reactive. And so, all of us as people, we carry this family of origin functioning into our organizations, both the good and the bad. But again, the key point, much like the one brought up earlier, is that it really only takes one person working on themselves to alter the trajectory of the entire family or the entire church or the entire workplace that they are part of. And so, if we can stay connected, if we can stay calm, if we can stay self defined, then this transmission will slow and over time become eliminated. And so, these are your questions for consideration in developing your differentiation. Moving on to sibling position, which I think is a really fascinating concept. Murray Bowen tells us that we proceed from the assumption that a person's family really represents the most influential context of life. And we do focus that on a lot, but really we don't focus on not just family or parents, but we need to focus also on other factors such as sibling position. And so Bowen integrated this concept from another researcher. He's done some, I think it's family constellation. He's done some great research on this. And he incorporated this idea of sibling position into systems theory. And really what it says, and this isn't 100% deterministic, but birth order can provide, depending on your level of differentiation, predictable functioning patterns for both the oldest, middle, youngest, and only child. He also has data on twins as well. Again, this data, these patterns aren't necessarily deterministic, but there's something to be considered as they can impact and interact with the family's emotional process. And I will say that the higher a person's level of differentiation, really the less impact sibling position has on predicting their functioning. But at the same time, the lower the level of a person's differentiation, the more impact that their sibling position can have on predicting their functioning in areas of life. And so Also, for consideration, a parent's own anxiety level and their own habits of projection can also distort natural sibling roles. Functioning position is possible to differ despite actual birth order. So, for example, we sometimes make the assumption, according to this theory, that younger children are less likely to act as an oldest child um, or act as a leader like oldest children. This theory assumes that if you're an oldest child, you're more likely to be a leader. But we can actually see that this isn't 100% deterministic, but usually there's a systems theory and a reason for that, such as maybe there's 8 years between the oldest child and the youngest child, and so the youngest child actually operates more like an only child. And so this is just helpful to know because it can influence your perception in the way that you show up for responsibility, for leadership, and relationships. It's always good to learn about your colleagues and what was their birth order because it is, again, another opportunity for you to give them grace and understand maybe why they operate and why they think the way that they do. So it's very helpful in relationships. So as we mentioned earlier, your sibling position will interact with your differentiation of self. For example, I'm a oldest son of girls, and so if I'm unhealthy or not in a good place or experiencing high levels of stress, I can easily overfunction in a leadership position. While I've seen other colleagues that I'm friends with that serve in their roles and they grew up as a youngest person, very calm, very laid back, and when they're under stress, they can sometimes ghost a situation and disconnect and really underperform. And so, no position is really better than another. They all come with their own strengths and they all come with their own weaknesses. But the good news is, as you grow in your own level of differentiation, sibling position has less and less of a negative impact, and then the strengths of your sibling position can become greater and greater. As I mentioned earlier, we will mirror the sibling dynamics from our family of origin into the workplace or where we serve and volunteer, into our teams, into our churches, into our PTAs, where we can operate much in the way that we did in our family of origin. And so the good news is the more we become differentiated, the more we can operate beyond these sibling stereotypes. And so the key takeaway here is to know your sibling position, but don't be ruled by it, and then know the sibling position of your colleagues and use it as an opportunity to give grace and understanding, not to be diagnostic and judgmental. And these are questions for consideration in developing our level of differentiation. Last but not least, we have the emotional process in society. This was the last piece of Murray Bowen's theory, and I think it really does complete the theory. He says that the emotional problems in society are very similar to the emotional problems in the family. And he's demonstrated that we are in a period of increasing societal anxiety. And I would say all you have to do is turn on the television today or look on your social media page to see that that is true now more than it ever was. And so, according to Bowen and Gilbert, society behaves like a very large emotional system. It reacts to chronic anxiety much like families do. And so, when societal anxiety increases, people within society begin to shift toward reactivity, polarization, and fusion, or losing their self. Bowen notes that this type of societal regression mirrors low level differentiation, but does it at a scale. And so the symptoms of anxiety at a societal level are increased blame and conflict, quick fix thinking, the loss of long term perspective, and a heightened sensitivity to differences. Much like families, societal emotional process is very predictable. It is not random at all. And we then, as a result, can see these leaders of society and leaders within or institutions themselves become triangulated by undifferentiated people as this anxiety intensifies in society. And so it is the level of differentiation of individuals within society that can influence the stability of broader society. In other words, the way that you show up in your family, the way that you learn to grow and become more differentiated, you can have a positive or a negative ripple effect on society. So, what you do and how you choose to function as an individual really does have a significant impact on society. And so, how does this emotional process shape leadership and systems? Well, during times of extreme chronic anxiety, and I would argue that we're living during that time in 2026, societies can regress. They can want and demand easy, short term solutions and quick fixes instead of thoughtful, careful planning. They can start to respond to each other, to leaders, and to institutions through very authoritarian and fused base responses and communication. And we can see extreme levels of distance and cutoff between groups. Again, something we see very present in today's society. It's unfortunate, but this type of societal emotional process actually then amplifies or multiplies anxiety at the family level. And so we can see this spill over, and then families begin to increase their own projection, their own triangles, and their own over under functioning reciprocity. These highly reactive societies, they want certainty, they want guarantee, they want speed, they want to be able to vent and emote as opposed to being calm, non anxious people who make decisions slowly, carefully, and thoughtfully over principles and values. However, the good news is if you're a leader in a role in your community with a high level of differentiation, you can then counteract this systemic societal level of anxiety by being a calm presence in the midst of an anxious environment. You can then help others to have clear thinking in spite of societal reactivity, and your non anxious leadership style can resist polarization and actually de escalate the tension in society. And so the key point here is that societal regression slows over time when you, as an individual, work on your own level of differentiation. Even one well differentiated leader can influence the functioning of an entire community. This is proven in theory, and I can tell you that from personal experience, this is 100% true in the real world. And so these are your questions for consideration and developing your own level of differentiation. Thank you so much for your attention to this. This is something that I do on a volunteer basis. I love coaching pastors. I love coaching individuals, both young and old, and I love working with corporations and businesses to help grow teams. If this is something that you're interested in and that you would like to discuss in greater detail, do not hesitate to leave me a message and to reach out to Crosspoint Coaching. I'm also on Instagram as well. You can DM me, and we will work together so that you can focus on elevating your own level of differentiating. Thank you.